Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm James Hymowitz. I'm the president of China Institute, and I'm just going to begin this program where I can see we're waiting for people to join us, but we're so delighted to have what's going to be a really, really interesting discussion. For those of you that don't know China Institute, we're in Lower Manhattan, and we are the city's leading cultural and educational organization that helps Americans better understand China through art, through culture, through history, through language programs. And one of the programs that we're most proud of is our film program. And I couldn't be more honored and delighted than to welcome this evening Richard Peña, who's joining us. And for those of you, think about the wonders of technology. I'm sitting at China Institute in New York. Richard is on a program this year teaching at the Sorbonne in Paris. So thank you so much for staying up late at night to lead this discussion. Tonight, it's our virtual stages program about an elephant sitting still. And the film is the latest in our Seeing China Through Film series, which actually takes viewers on a tour of China's greatest films, curated by none other than Richard himself. For those of you who don't know him, he really doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do a very short one anyway. He's a professor of film studies at Columbia University, where he specializes in film theory and international cinema. From 1988 to 2012, he was the program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festival. Towards the end of the program, Richard's going to be taking questions from the audience. So please type up your questions and put them into the Q&A box, and we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can. I know it's also a long film, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion. So maybe, Richard, you could turn on your screen and take over from here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, James, for that warm introduction. Actually, it's not that late in Paris, and I'd probably be up anyway. So it's a pleasure to be up to have a discussion about a film which I care for so much. Frankly, I would say in the last 10 years, two films that have meant the most to me, I think, have been Kylie Blues, which we spoke about last time, and this film. Two absolutely remarkable films, and which show a continuing vitality in China. So often, we can sometimes be disappointed. Certainly, we don't have the excitement that existed when we first were discovering Chinese cinema back in the 1980s and 90s. But in fact, it shows that there are still enormous pockets of real creativity going on in China, despite, as in many other places on earth, the kind of push towards a more commercial, more accessible cinema. We still have artists who can be uncompromising, as much as Bigan and, sadly, the late Hu Bo, because as I'm sure many of you know, this is the first and last film by Hu Bo. He committed suicide in October of 2017, really before the film had its international premiere at Berlin in February of 2018. Terrible loss for cinema based on this film. Clearly, this was somebody who was already a major talent. So the fact that we lost him so early is really sad. The only good thing we can say is the wonder of cinema is that, of course, it preserves work so that Hu Bo will be with us forever, although not in person, just in terms of this great masterpiece that he left for us. So let me go on. I have a PowerPoint I'd like to go over, and I'll try and leave 15, 20 minutes for questions. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about the film. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing the PowerPoint right now. Great. We'll be talking about an elephant sitting still, and I'm doing this, of course, for the China Institute in New York in 2022. Okay, probably the first thing that kind of really strikes me in thinking about this film is the question of time. We spoke about that also with Kylie Blues, but I think here again, time becomes a really major aspect of, in a sense, what the film is about and the kind of meditation that the film does, I think, even in terms of its depiction of the story we're going to be looking at. Now, cinema is, for many of us, the art of time. In fact, if we go back to the 19th century, there was really an enormous kind of move in certainly Western European culture, but I think in others as well, to really, in a way, figure out how to conquer time and space. Things like the telegraph, the telephone, even the railroad and the steamship really altered our sense of time, how long it was to get from one place to another, or what it meant to sort of have a day's journey. And this was often reflected in the ways that artists often try to capture time. Of course, we could talk in literature about people like Proust and Joyce and many others who kind of certainly played with time. But I think in the visual arts, there was an especially interesting movement. Part of it was, in a sense, derived from the idea of how, from the illusion of movement, in the 19th century was full of a lot of optical toys and whatever that reproduced movements in different ways. Things like the zoetrope or phenakistoscope. These were devices where you spun them and you would see otherwise still objects suddenly put into motion. So this became a way of trying to reproduce time. Time could be divided by cutting it into pieces and then recreating it. We have a lot of interesting examples of that. I'm sure many of you, many of you know the great series by Claude Monet of the Gare Saint-Lazare, not too far from where I'm living here in Paris, where he went there and over a number of weeks did a series of paintings just trying to capture the place. Now, again, Monet was a member of a film movement that became known as Impressionism. So one could say that rather than trying to give you a faithful kind of recreation of the space, he was trying to give you his impression of it. Any impression of Gare Saint-Lazare would have to include movement because, of course, it's full of movement, and the way in which certain of the effects in that railroad station, as well as any other, especially in the 19th century, the smoke, the steam, everything else must become part of one's overall impression of what it was like to be there. So we can see, if we really look at these Gare Saint-Lazare paintings together, there's often a way in which they form pairs based around movement. So for example, here we have, you see a train pretty much at the distance, and then there's another one where the train has come forward. It seems to have arrived from where it was. Or again, we have another sort of painting here, and once again, the same sort of idea of these trains actually moving in space. One of the things Monet seems to be doing is, again, breaking down action into successive frames. He can't capture the movement, but he can show you the movement in different pieces, different kind of stages. This was an idea. Monet was painting these in 1877, 1878. Within just a few years, a number of photographers, notably a Scottish photographer who lived on the west coast of the United States named Edward Muybridge, would also experiment with that idea of breaking down time into successive pieces, successive portions. So, of course, I'm sure many of you have seen his remarkable series, which he called Animal Locomotion, where he took these images of people performing very often simple tasks like walking or climbing stairs or whatever. And what he would do is simply break down the action into successive photographic frames. He had an elaborate setup so that as this character was walking, he would continually hit a tripwire, and each tripwire would, in fact, set off a photographic machine. So perhaps this trajectory might just take 3 seconds or something like that. If we had a bigger image, you can actually test it by seeing these numbers along the way. Muybridge was scientific, if he was anything, even though he often or almost always had his characters completely naked, and say this is a trajectory of 3 seconds. Well, 3 seconds is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 frames. So he's taken 3 seconds and represented it to us in 12 different images. And this is really, you can see just by looking at this, that what Muybridge was doing in the early 1880s was inventing a kind of proto-cinema. wasn't exactly cinema, but one could say the theory of cinema was known to him. Whether he could articulate it or not, certainly he intuited that what cinema would do would be to break down action into successive frames. In fact, Muybridge even built a machine called a Zoopraxiscope, where he could take these photographs, each one printed on a glass slide, and actually create a certain kind of staccato movement among all of them. So it's a question among scholars sometimes whether or not we should think of that as cinema, or in fact, we just think of it using the word I just used, proto-cinema. Here's another series. Again, his actions were often very simple. Here, a woman moving up and down the steps with carrying a jug. So again, this was how Muybridge worked. And again, we see how he decided to show us the kind of passage of time by breaking down time into successive parts. Now, cinema, of course, follows this trajectory. When we're thinking of celluloid cinema, even when we're thinking about electronic or digital cinema, the action is actually divided into different frames. In celluloid cinema, especially sound cinema, the action was divided into 24 frames per second. Now, just a little bit of information in case you didn't know, each of these 24 frames would actually be only projected for about 1/48th of a second, because following that projection, there would be about 1/48th of a second of black. A shutter would come down so that each separate still image was in fact separated by a very brief period of black. And then 1/48th of a second later, a new photographic image would be shown. That's how, in a sense, movement is created. Basically, when you go to see a film, you're watching a fancy slideshow. The slides are being presented, though, at such rapidity that your brain, unable to tell the difference between each successive image, actually creates what we call the illusion of movement. Okay, so movement is something you could say, and time, very much at the heart of cinema itself. And indeed, it's interesting to see how even 120 some odd years later, we still have young directors like Wei Bu making films that I think are really very interesting meditations on the sense of time. You know, time can be continuous, relentless, moving forward, as I think we feel it is very much in a film like An Elephant Sitting Still. So now, of course, we've seen in this series a number of films that in their own way also dealt with time. In fact, I think one of the things about China, especially for those of us in the West, is often trying to date it. That is, to think of it in terms of our own categories, such as modernization or classical periods or things like that, and see how it fits. And indeed, many of these films had within them a kind of what you might think of as unconscious or silently stated sense of time in one way. The Goddess, hopefully you'll remember that from last summer, the great Chinese silent film from 1934, is really in many ways about incomplete modernization. It's about a Shanghai which on the surface looks very modern, yet somehow is still incomplete. They still have very feudal ideas, for example, about how to punish a woman who's living a life of sin in terms of they're punishing her children and things like that. Crows and Sparrows, of course, is set right at the dawn of the new era, that is the creation of the communist government. And throughout, we get that sense of the idea that we're at the edge of one era and the beginning of another era. And those of you who saw the film might recall the film even ends on New Year's, on Chinese New Year's, to again really emphasize that idea of moving into a new era. Two Stage Sisters, which I spoke about, actually includes a very classic Chinese narrative form, which is the before and after narrative. That is, giving you a narrative which takes before a crucial event, in this case, the founding of the People's Republic, and then continues it, at least for implications of what happens after that. So again, we're always thinking of moving up to a certain moment and then moving beyond it. Even Yellow Earth has within it the sense of a new versus an old China. certainly the Shaoxing Plateau, where the film takes place, or Shanxing, sorry, Plateau where the film takes place, is very much a kind of old China versus Brother Gu, the young communist cadre who goes to collect songs there, representing a new China. Now, the last three films we've seen, Suzu River, Kylie Blues, and An Elephant Sitting Still, time is much more malleable, much more flexible. Suzu River, of course, is based on a lot of repetitions. It's hard for us to understand, perhaps, if things are happening simultaneously or consecutively, something that actually Elephant Sitting Still also works with. Kylie Blues, as we spoke about last time, is again based on a very complex time frame where we see characters sometimes in different stages of their lives, as young boys, as teenagers, or as people who were in prison and are now out of prison, of characters who were alive in the film but are now dead. So in a sense, we get a lot of really complex renderings of time in all of these films, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with An Elephant Sitting Still. Now, An Elephant Sitting Still, I have down here 2017. That's when the film was first shown actually in China. It had its world premiere and really in a certain way caused a great stir at 2018 when it was shown at the Berlin Film Festival, and very soon afterwards in New York at the New Directors New Film Series, which is presented by Museum of Modern Art and Lincoln Center. And from there, it went on to at least great critical success. Obviously, it was not a box office favorite, although it did reasonably well for a film of such challenge and such length. Actually, for me, An Elephant Sitting Still is one of those rare examples where a number of people I know told me how great the film was. And in a way, I always think, oh, that's a kiss of death. I won't like it. But of course, I liked it even more than people said that I would like it. Now, Hubo, again, very young man, only 28 years old when he killed himself, was a novelist as well as a filmmaker. And remember this as I go into my analysis. He went like almost all the filmmakers whose work we've seen so far, I mean, sort of more recent filmmakers, everyone from Yellow Earth on, to the Beijing Film Academy, which has really been the kind of major source for Chinese filmmakers going back to the 1950s. He also became very close to the Hungarian director Béla Tarr, whose work may be familiar to some of you. He certainly, for a number of years, was seen as one of the leading directors, a very challenging director, maker of works such as Satan Tango, 7.5-hour film, which we showed at the New York Film Festival in the mid-90s, a number of other films, The Man from London, The Turin Horse, really an extraordinary director in many ways, who stopped making films to start his own film school. And in fact, Hubo was associated with that for a couple of years. Tarr remains one of his great champions and was really distraught after Hubo's suicide. Now, the film is set in Shijiazhuang in Hebei province. And of course, what's interesting about that is Hebei, of course, is also the home of Beijing. So in a sense, while it feels really far away. Now, when we saw Kylie Blues, we spoke about the idea of minorities and kind of those very distant areas of China where one doesn't feel the Chinese miracle, where one doesn't feel all of that's going on. This, of course, feels very remote, very downtrodden, but it's not really that far out of what you might think of as the main area of China. Kylie Blues clearly was. I mean, again, we have the Miao people there and whatever. This is really in a part of China that's really not that far from the capital. Shijiazhuang is actually a former mining town. And of course, throughout, from the very beginning, we just have the whole sense of this is an area in sharp decline. Nothing seems to be working, things seem to be closing down. There's a constant sound of trains, a reminder of people leaving. In a way, it's a very kind of how could you say, negative portrait, very almost depressing portrait of a place. And indeed, one could say that rather than black and white, the film seems to be shot in gray and white. There's just an incredible grayness, which really dominates the visual palette of the film. The circus, of course, that we speak about, this infamous circus where there is this elephant sitting still is in Manzhouli. And Manzhouli is a town that's actually on the border with Inner Mongolia. It's a border town. And it's also a major railway center. It's a place where, in fact, there's a lot of commerce, a huge amount of commerce moving north out of China, moves through Manzhouli. So it has a little bit of the reputation as a place that's a way out, that this is really a border town where many things leave China. And of course, our four main characters all seem to be searching for some kind of way out of their lives, and of course, some way out of Shijiazhuang. Here's right here, here's Hebei. As you can see, Manzhouli is right about up here. It's very, again, on the border, a way out. And much of this, of course, is a former industrial area, which, of course, now has really seen hard times. One could call it maybe the Rust Belt of China. Now, in a way, when we think of a filmmaker, I often like to think of, which area in cinematic expression does he work most with? And I think in the case of An Elephant Sitting Still, for me, that would very much be cinematography. He had a very good relationship with his cinematographer, and clearly much of, I think, the expressive content of the film comes through the way that it's shot. The first thing we might notice is the film has extremely long takes. There are many, many shots in the film which last several minutes, so much so that after a while we don't even notice how long they are. Now, of course, Kylie Blues had that famous 42-minute take. There's nothing like that here, but the entire film is made up of these very, very long takes, several minutes. Even though the film is 4 hours or almost 4 hours, I would say there probably aren't 100 shots in the film, making it, again, a film where each of the shots is several minutes long. The camera is completely handheld, and there's also constant camera movement. Even though the film is in no way a documentary, of course, this handheld camera and constant camera movement gives us almost a documentary sense. This is the language of documentary: handheld cameras, camera movement, and the film, although fiction, uses it. So it creates a kind of metaphor that even though what we're seeing is a fiction film, there is a kind of aspect of it being a document, a chronicle of a time and place. The characters are often shot in extremely close distances. And it's an interesting thing I've noticed in a number of work by recent filmmakers where they bring the camera incredibly close to their characters. It's more than just a close-up. Close-ups were used classically to give us a sense of detail or more information. This proximity of the camera does neither of those things. If anything, it just really creates a kind of sense of claustrophobia, of characters almost being trapped, really being under close scrutiny, rather than giving us more information. So I've seen this in a number of films. Even I was thinking there's a wonderful Egyptian film from a few years ago called In the Last Days of the City. And it uses a very similar camera style where, again, the camera is very, very close, practically on top of the characters, and yet that proximity doesn't give us more information. It just creates, again, this very restricted, closed sense of the world around these characters. Certainly the palette of the film is muted. The film was actually shot in color, but in fact, it was processed and also shot in such a way to give it almost a sense of being, as I mentioned, gray and white. Very little sense of color or life in the film. One feels that the drabness, the grayness that we see around the characters extends out to the world. And again, this is an old sort of cinematic ploy, a kind of sense that goes back to the whole idea of expressionism, the way in which the world mirrors the characters that we see. At the same time, the film does emphasize natural light. There are very few scenes in the film where there's any artificial light, even though characters are often in the shadows and we see them in shadows. The film seems to emphasize that. Time's really passing. I better speed up a bit. The film is completely location shot. There's very little sense in the film of the economic miracle. When we think of contemporary China, we do have to think of the most remarkable economic boom in the history of chronicling such things. There's never been a country that in 30, 40 years has so completely changed its economic reality. And yet we get very little sense of that. There's never a sense that, we're in a place where there's any kind of progress. In fact, it feels once again as a place in which progress has passed it by. The sense of Kylie Blues is almost a film where that progress hasn't arrived or hasn't arrived yet. This, of course, is one where perhaps for a few years it enjoyed that sense of progress, but now we see closed factories, bad schools, apartment buildings that seem like they're falling apart, etc. Again, much of this carries over to the choice that the filmmaker made in terms of the clothing, the drabness of the clothing, the school uniforms, and also the fact that he chose to shoot in many locations that look alike. Very often, one of the ways that we understand films is by understanding the differences in where the action is set. Here, that's very difficult because so many of the places look alike. Now, again, to go along with the editing, the cinematography, the filmmaker chose for his editing strategy to keep those long shots. Sometimes filmmakers shoot very lengthy shots, but then, of course, cut them into various parts during the editing. That's not what happened here. Interestingly, I think while we watch these long shots, we're often aware of the duration. There's a sense in which Hubo keeps each shot practically as long as it can be, and we sense that tension that goes on during the filming of that. Almost we're waiting for another shot as a kind of relief from what we're looking at. Now, we'll look at examples of this in a minute, but one of the things he often does is sort of replace shots, meaning we'll often get a shot where one character is walking, very often with their back towards us, and then suddenly we'll cut to another character in a similar position. And this is something that Hubo does to create a sense of rhyming. I wouldn't say so much connection, we'll talk more about that, but there's a sense in which the film is often built on these kinds of visual rhymes. Time is continuous, but at the same time, several times, it seems to be simultaneous. That is, we'll be watching a sequence and not be aware of the fact it's actually taking place at the same time as a sequence we saw before that. So again, there's a lot of play with time that goes on here. This kind of connection in terms of shot replacement or simultaneity of action creates connections between characters, but those events are, in a sense, rarely ever followed up. The connection is made, but to what end? So again, the film plays very loosely with that. And again, I'll talk more about that in a minute. Sound, again, this very occasional use of music. It's never commentative. Happy about that. I personally find so many contemporary filmmakers really overuse music. Again, there's natural sounds of spaces. The film begins with a voiceover by Wei Bu, the student in the film, telling the story of the elephant. And indeed, I think this is a kind of reference to something I'll expand more on, the link between this film and a certain kind of very classical Chinese novel narrative. Hubo was a writer. He published 2 novels. He was only 28 when he died, but clearly this was a very ambitious, very energetic person. He published 2 novels, several short stories, made a couple of short films before he made his almost 4-hour An Elephant Sitting Still. And I think that impact of the classic Chinese novel is something we'll see in the way that the film is constructed. And finally, of course, the film ends very enigmatically. We have this shot of the characters outside a bus as they're trying to make it to Manzhouli, the place where the circus with this elephant is. We actually hear the off-screen cry of an elephant, but the film might ask us, is this real? Or in fact, is it just their desire, which has in fact made this cry of the elephant part of the soundtrack? Okay, now, one of the things that intrigues me most about the film is the way in which, while being an extremely contemporary film, it really harks back, in my opinion, to much earlier forms of Chinese storytelling, especially within novels. One of the things the film gives us is different plot lines happening simultaneously, and in a certain way, connected by time and space, that is, they're happening in the same city on the same day. The entire action of the film takes place in one day, but in fact, they're quite separate. The scholar Andrew Plax has called this the use of, within Chinese novels, especially classic novels, interstitial narratives, lines going on simultaneously with little or only occasional connection. Now, again, while I think this is very much a Chinese form, it's not exactly how could you say, unknown in our own sort of media. Think of a lot of contemporary television. Very often contemporary television will have several plot lines going on at the same time. If you watch, a show like ER or something, you'll have, the romantic story and the story of one patient and the problems with and they're all going on at the same time. So that idea of simultaneity is something that exists in certain of our forms too. Plaques and others argue that it really is the guiding principle of classic Chinese novels, such as Dream of the Red Chamber or The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. There's no sense of, I said mobbing, it should be, I think, moving towards resolution or conclusion. One of the things about the classic Chinese novels is they tend not to have a real denouement, that is a real way in which the action actually gets concluded or resolved in some way. What they are collections of these stories. We sort of live through experiences with characters without that underlying satisfaction, which perhaps comes from the actions reaching some sort of conclusion. Now, Western narratives tend to be based, I'm thinking especially in the last few hundred years, on what Plax calls an architectonic structure. There's an introduction to the action, there's rising action, denouement, falling action, and a conclusion. Okay, again, I think especially if you look at Hollywood films, one of the important things about Hollywood films is they not only begin, but they end. They end in such a way that whatever the problem introduced was is solved in one way. It might be the couple finally gets married. We don't know what their marriage will be like, but there's usually an indication that it'll all work out, or the monster is dead for good, or that the outlaws in the Western have been put in jail or have been killed, or something like that. So there's a sense in which they conclude. One of the things often, again, about classic Chinese novels is they don't really conclude. They just sort of taper off. And I would say that that is something I would argue also happens in An Elephant Sitting Still. Now, Chinese classical narrative, on the contrary, doesn't really have this sense of an overarching narrative structure. There's little sense of really a firm beginning, middle, or end. And there's usually very little problem that's really presented to us, no deadline. We have to do this by next week or by next year. What Chinese novels, to use the term that's applied to them very often are, is really a series of small, loosely connected stories. And that seems to me a good description of An Elephant Sitting Still. We have at least 4 major plot lines going on simultaneously with people who have really very tenuous connections. One could say some of them come together at the end with this trip to Manzhouli to see the elephant, but clearly it doesn't resolve anything. If we think back to The Dream of the Red Chamber, certainly if one wanted to say the overriding story, at least in my reading of it, is the love triangle between Jia Baoyu and his 2 cousins. And occasionally we return to it, but there's never any real progress. He never really moves towards one or the other. Different arguments or different kind of events are presented to us, but it doesn't really resolve in any way. It just becomes one of the sort of themes, one of the motifs that the story returns to again and again. Much more in Dream of the Red Chamber, and I think in a lot of other classic Chinese novels. In my reading of them, I'm certainly not an expert, I had to read them, of course, in English, is the idea that texture and really capturing a sense of the world is more important than relating a story. And especially in Dream of the Red Chamber, you get an extraordinary sense of, the world of wealthy families, of their, lack of kind of, how could you say, ambition or desire. You get extraordinary descriptions of their meals, of their houses, but you don't really get a lot of story. I mean, that may be one way in which the novels are saying these are people who aren't doing terribly much. But anyway, be that as it may. Now, just again, to just give you a very bad visual, we think of our 4 major characters, Wei Bu, who's a student, Yu Cheng, who's a gang member, Huang Ling, the young woman who's having an affair with her vice principal, and then Wang Zhang, the old man with the dog. In a certain way, we could almost think of the film as sort of starting out with a fair amount about Wei Bu. Then he disappears for a while from the story, and then he comes back, disappears for a much longer time, and then comes back again. At the same time as the Wei Bu story, we also have some of the Yu Cheng story, but then he disappears for a very long time and then comes back. This kind of structure is, again, very typical of the classic Chinese novel. I think it's really a form of narration that Hubo is evoking in this, even though it's, a very contemporary film set in a very contemporary part of China, telling you a story about today's China. For me, it's really interesting that he's reached back and taken something that was part of classical Chinese culture and given it a very fresh, much more contemporary look. Compare it to the way in which Yellow Earth takes Song Dynasty painting and in a certain way brings that visual style up to a kind of cinematographic presence. Okay, now again, as I mentioned, the film takes place in less than one day. In a sense, time is really, if anything here, presented as repetition. And I think that's one of the ways in which we see this constant way in which characters are replaced. One character will be walking, we'll follow them for a while, then suddenly we cut to another character in a very similar position. It gives a sense of repetition. And with that repetition, the inference of the inability to change. And indeed, characters are told several times in the film that they cannot change their fates. This is just the way it is. So that indeed, both on the kind of contextual level and the visual level, this idea of the inability to change is really emphasized for us. As I mentioned, for me, the ending is certainly not conclusive. It's just one more event that happens. Will they actually see the elephant? And if they do, what will it mean? Will it mean anything to their lives? The film, I think, doesn't give us that. We just sort of end there, and we have that very enigmatic cry of the elephant, which in a certain way, we have to question whether or not it happens. The point of view in the film is never personalized. As I mentioned, there are four main characters, and even though the film is often very close to them, spatially especially, it never really adopts anyone's point of view. Now, again, we certainly have a lot of Western narratives where you have the story moving among different characters, but usually while it's on that character, the film belongs to them, you could say, and then we might move to another one. Here, the sort of focus is always shifting from character to character. If anything, rather than point of view of characters, one of the things that really structures the film are different kinds of events which happen again and again. And sadly, I think some of the events that we see evoked quite a bit are beatings and death. Let me just show you. Now, I mentioned about how Wu Bei begins speaking, and the camera then goes from Yu Cheng to Wang Jing to Huang Ling. Sorry, the slides are better. We see here, for example, Yu Cheng getting up. We later learn that, of course, he's been sleeping with the wife of a good friend. And we hear this kind of story. People gather there, watching it sitting still. This is, of course, the student Wei Bu who's giving us this kind of introduction. Many classic Chinese novels, too, also begin with a narrator who appears it doesn't really remain a constant presence. That's one of the reasons why people often have trouble thinking about these novels historically, because very often there are things like narrators who appear and disappear. So it's led to some suspicion that often maybe these novels were rewritten, but be that as it may, I'll leave that to the scholars of this area. We then move, of course, to the old man. We move to Huang Ling, the young woman, and then finally to the boy, Wu Bei, who started the narration. And among the first things we hear, a lousy day starts again. So again, this becomes almost a motto, the slogan that greets us in this film. Now, I mentioned the following shot. This is, again, one of the most frequent technical figures we have in the film. Someone is walking, and then they'll be replaced by someone else. So here, for example, we see the old man, Wang Jing, walking with his little dog, and we cut to the student, Wei Bu, kind of walking with his friend, and we'll see what happens to them. But again, we have a character with his back to us, another character with his back to us. It's a way in which you could say the film is challenging us to make a connection, but certainly not establishing what that connection is. it's a certain rhyme, a way in which their lives are connected, perhaps not in a personal way, but in a kind of more general metaphoric way. Both of them are characters who are down and out, who in a certain way are suffering from the little hope that the city really does give us. Beatings, which often might be moments that are important rites within a film, something that changes the action, seem to almost take place here like clockwork. Not every few minutes, but during several times, we'll just sort of see a beating kind of happen or be evoked in some way. They're rarely disjunctive events. They don't really move the narrative off into a new direction. So here, of course, we get, in the story of Wei Bu, him talking about how my dad used to interrogate people with this when he sees a kind of rubber hose. Later on, of course, we have the confrontation at school, where, of course, he'll kill this young boy by pushing him down the stairs, somewhat accidentally. We later go to the hospital where the young man who's been hurt is being kept. And even while Wei Bu is watching this, a fight breaks out. And he watches, again, a sort of just sudden eruption of violence. Later on, of course, we see him. He gets beat up by some of the gang members because, of course, the young man who he killed accidentally was the brother of a gang leader. Later on, of course, we see the Huang Ling actually beating this school vice principal with whom she's having an affair, sort of kicking him out of her house. So again, beatings happen on a regular basis. It's almost like they don't really, in a certain way, define or culminate the action, but in fact, they're just things that happen every day. So within this one day, we see all of these characters involved in some kind of scene of either getting beaten or beating someone else. Now, death, and I'll end with this so we can have some time for questions. Again, is something that happens here. Of course, we see the scene where Yu Cheng witnesses here the suicide, the death that we get of his friend whose wife he slept with. You see him, you hear how it goes off. Then finally, we see him. And then, of course, we see the body here on the ground, the death of this young man after he's fallen from his balcony. Later on, of course, we get this scene, which I've spoken about already, where accidentally this boy here, Shuai Li, is pushed down the stairs to his death. We see, again, that sort of expression, the kind of almost shock and almost incomprehension about what's happened. Again, we see the body on the ground. You can see how often the film rhymes. It evokes itself. It shows us similar scenes. None of these scenes in a certain way are cathartic in the way they don't stop the action, move the action, transform the action. One of the things I think the film does is show us all of this as part of every day. Later on here, of course, we have the scene where the old man sees his dog get killed by another dog. Okay, and we see the dog after it's had a fight, terribly wounded. And then, of course, there's the whole plot where he goes and tries to get the owners of the dog that killed his dog to pay them. Finally, simultaneity, as I mentioned, much of the action in the film seems to take place at the same time. So even though we watch consecutive sequences, if we think about it, they're actually happening simultaneously. And this is something that I think perhaps Hubo borrowed from his friend and mentor, the Hungarian director Béla Tarr. In Béla Tarr's great masterpiece, Satan Tango, you watch the first 3 hours of the film, and only at the end of it do you realize that what you've been watching are sequences that have been happening simultaneously. That in fact, what looks consecutive, because of course one sequence followed the other, they're actually happening simultaneously. And Tarr gives us little clues, but it's not clearly established until the end of that first part. So, for example, we have here the scene when, of course, he's writing a note. Later on, we see the young woman who's there waiting for the note. So again, the film often has actions that seem consecutive actually turn out to be simultaneous. Okay, I've been speaking for a long time. I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So let me stop my talk and see what's been asked. Please, if you would put your questions into the Q&A so we can have them together rather than the chat, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Richard. For everyone watching, my name is Aaron Nicholson, and I am the acting director of programs here at China Institute. Richard, it is just such a pleasure, to listen to you, pull apart the film this way. I think for everyone watching, I definitely did this the right way, which is that I finished this film last night, and so I think just to sort of immerse yourself in the film, and then to enter into a conversation like this, it's just such a treat to be able to, listen to you speak and pick up on so many of the things, that you've noticed, and sort of reflect on, how I saw this in different ways. So we had a couple questions from the audience coming in, and as Richard said, please continue to type your questions. We do have time to get to some of them. Our first question is from Lin Zhang, and they are asking. They said, Professor Peña, you mentioned kindly blues many times in your lecture. Obviously, that's a part of this Seeing China Through Film series. The question is, how do you see the connection between the two films? Do you think that they represent Chinese film in the 21st century?
Well, thank you for the question. Can you think of any films that represent American cinema in the 21st century? Obviously, there's so much production going on that I think both Kylie Blues and An Elephant Sitting Still are examples of Chinese cinema, but in a certain way, one could argue they're no more representative than the great bulk of commercial productions, which open every year in China. I certainly think that they're not outliers. I think they do represent very interesting aspects of China, and I think their filmmakers are very thoughtful. So because of that, I'm attracted to them, and I hopefully other people are too. Other Chinese films, I think, perhaps not as thoughtful. But the fact is they were made somewhat around the same time. I guess Kylie Blues was a little bit before that. One thing that's interesting is that both Bigan and Hubo are people with a strong basis in literature. I mentioned that Bigan is a poet, and we hear a lot of his poetry in the film. In the film, he makes direct reference to, for example, the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. And clearly, this is a man who's read pretty widely, if he knows the work of Pessoa, and other poets. Hubo, who is a novelist, and in fact, the elephant episode comes out of his second novel, a novel called Huge Crack. In a way, as I said, for me, watching the film and having at one point spent part of my life trying to understand classic Chinese novels, it really brought me back to that because it seemed to have such a similar structure to things like, or lack of structure, to things like Dream of a Red Chamber or Romance of the Three Kingdoms, where you have dozens of stories at some points going on with little kind of real interaction among them. It's just a kind of collection of these stories. One can see, I think, An Elephant Sitting Still as an example of that. And as I mentioned, just like Chen Kaige, working with cinematographer Zhang Yimou, brings a very old Chinese visual style into the 20th century for Yellow Earth, I think I could argue that Hubo does that for a classic Chinese novel style with a film like An Elephant Sitting Still.
Absolutely, and I think the connection that you draw between these classical Chinese novels, Dream of the Red Chamber in particular, is something I'm going to be thinking about, for the rest of the week. A second question from Rhonda Wu. She said, "What messages do you think Hubo wanted us to take away?" And her second question, not related: how is this a reworking of Jason and the Argonauts?
How interesting. Well, I'll try the first one first and see if I can think about an answer to the second one. Again, I think one of the things that we found, at least to my mind, in a lot of the best, Chinese films of the last 20 years, again, the fact of the extraordinary transformation of China is undeniable. I've been myself quite a few times, and it is so impressive. Yet, like any transformation, there is the underside of that, the seamy side. And for me, that's one of the things I love about art, that art will often remind us of those things that perhaps we don't see right away, perhaps aren't that visible to us, but are very much part of the experience. I think someone like Bigan is really talking about a world that's been outside of this transformation of China. You get little hints of it, but actually the area he's filming in, whatever, is not part of all that China has gone through. You see a couple of modern buildings and things like that, but certainly these aren't characters that are enjoying the economic miracle. That's even stronger in the case of An Elephant Sitting Still. These are young people who are being told they have no future. This is an old man whose children are trying to kick him out of the house. Clearly, whatever's happened in China has destroyed a lot of the most basic human relations that's going on. Now, China's not alone in this. We obviously have examples from our own country and things like that. But these filmmakers, I think, are saying, wait a minute, as we move forward, are we looking back? Are we looking to the side? Are we looking at those people who aren't benefiting from this? And so that to me is the message of these films. Now, some people see it as subversive, some see it as critical. It does have those aspects, but in fact, I think it's a very almost humanist stance to actually ask what the price of this has been. Recently we've been talking a lot about things like, the discovery of America, or, the arrival of the Europeans, I should say, in America, and the consequences of that. It's obviously an extraordinary event. Some of the people who did it were very brave and whatever, but it had consequences. It had terrible consequences for lots of people. So, I think more and more we're saying we can talk about the development of the United States, which was, again, extraordinary, but are we also talking about slavery? Are we also talking about what happened to Native Americans? Because that was very much part of the process. So if people see that as a criticism, okay, that's fine. But I think it's just a way of making us more aware of the complexity of any historical situation. In terms of Jason the Argonauts, I'm trying to think, Jason the Argonauts seems to me a much more classic sort of Western style narrative, in that you have a group of people come together who have a real goal. And the goal, of course, is to get the golden fleece. They, put together a boat. They encounter various dangers along the way, and in the end, of course, are able to complete their mission. So it seems very standard. In fact, it's a reworking of the Greek myth into a kind of classic Hollywood narrative.
Was going back to what you said before, was this film screened in China? Do we know anything about sort of its reception, or how widely this was able to be disseminated?
Yeah, actually the film was screened relatively well in China. It got, at least some of the reviews I've read, which are of course reviews that have been translated into English or French or some language I can read, were very positive. I hate to say it, but in a certain way, Hubo became less dangerous once he was dead.
Sure.
It was a little easier to praise the work because, of course, now he was gone. So you could, start, having all kinds of elegies to him and things like that. So I think it was taken well. And again, I think the Chinese authorities, to my mind, have always been very intelligent, realizing a film like this is going to, even in the West, be seen by an extremely small sliver of people. So it's not really like it's a danger to China in any way. And again, one can say that the story it tells is not an unfamiliar story to people in the West. Certainly every day we speak about all the people who've been left behind by, say, globalization. And we speak about these out-of-work factory workers or coal miners and the impact it's having on our own politics. Well, this is a little bit of a Chinese cognate to that, or analog to that.
Yeah, I think we've seen that with other films as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the worry is, with new directives from China's government coming out with Xi Jinping saying, we want to tell good Chinese stories.
Right.
That some of this kind of, whether it's honest storytelling or storytelling in general, that shows a bit more of China's underbelly,
right.
May become more and more sparse. Okay, we have another question from June Pang, this is quite specific. She says, there are many shots that only the characters close to the camera can be seen clearly, and not a character who's farther away.
Right.
A character even a little bit further away can be blurry. What is happening there? What is the film?
I'm so glad you brought that up. June, I think your name is. It's a very good observation, and certainly I should have mentioned it. Again, you have to think of filmmaking as a long series of choices. How am I going to do this shot? Well, here, going back again to cinematography, the working of the camera itself, a director has a choice. Do I use deep focus so I can see all the characters in a room and pretty good or sharp focus? Or do I use shallow focus so that even if a person is 2 feet away from one character, they become blurry? If you look at Hollywood, especially in, say, the 1930s, directors there often favored shallow focus, which meant that, someone, a couple walks into a restaurant crowded with people, and at first you see everybody, but the moment the couple sits down, you can't see anybody. Everybody else is out of focus. That was a very popular technique, or standard technique, I should say, in the 1930s in Hollywood. People like Orson Welles and others would introduce or reintroduce into Hollywood what people call deep focus, which meant that you could see characters on several planes of action. Hubo obviously could have done either, but exactly what you point out is, again, a way of isolating these characters so that even when they are with other people, visually, they seem alone.
Are those decisions that are made by the filmmaker himself, or is
Yes.
that the work of the cinematographer coming into
Well,
play?
I think it'd be a very lazy director who allowed, his cinematographer to make such choices. I mean, I don't think that's the case here. No, I think that, and I think what June points out goes along with much of the rest of the film. That this is a strategy so that these characters, I mean, again, one of the things I think that does come across in the film is this terrible sense of how alone these characters are. And many years ago, and not speaking Chinese, I don't know if this is true, someone told me there's no word in Chinese for being alone. I don't think that's probably true, but in a way it was such a communal society and such a family society that in a way the idea of being alone wasn't really something you thought about. Well, perhaps as China transforms, loneliness is now becoming more of a social factor. And I think Hubo finds the visual equivalent of it by showing so much of the film in what I call this soft or short focus.
You mentioned that Chinese authorities may have been under the impression that, a film like this is only going to go so far with a Western audience. I think one of the stumbling blocks, for any audience, maybe the length. Was that if you can speak about that very briefly, was that a particularly bold choice by Hubo, or was it something that he was trying to convey by sort of wrapping us in this melancholy for such an extended period of time?
I think both. I mean, I think if there's any quality of Béla Tarr, the Hungarian filmmaker who was, I think, very much Hubo's mentor, it's a certain kind of uncompromising quality. As I mentioned, for me, Béla Tarr's masterpiece is 7.5 hours, a film called Satan Tango. And again, I mean, he didn't make only 7.5-hour films, but this is a film he felt he needed the time, so he did it. And, and he got a lot of great press and whatever. It certainly didn't make a lot of money because, how many people are going to go see such a film? I think the same thing. I think Hubo made a film which for him was an expression. And what happened to it commercially and things like that are really not even secondary, tertiary concerns. I think the important thing was to make a film that really expressed his vision. And things like commerce and whatever, well, that takes the back seat. Surely he wasn't naive enough to think the film would be a blockbuster. I think he knew that it would reach a small audience, but happily it's a film that, was really played quite widely. It's been in many parts of the world and overwhelmingly gotten very favorable reviews.
I think we have one final question from Emma Han, and you've spoken about this a bit. She asks, can you please tell us a bit more about the reception of the film, both inside and outside of China?
Yes, I just addressed that.
Yeah.
Again, I'm a little hampered not being a Chinese speaker of knowing how it was addressed. Certainly the Chinese people that I know, and of course there are more people who were in cinema and things like that, had nothing but great things to say. They were very excited by the film, and of course sad that such a great filmmaker is gone. He's not, part of any cinema anymore. And what I saw outside of China was overwhelmingly a very popular response. I noticed, because, I'm essentially really more of a Latin Americanist than anything else, that actually Cinemateca Uruguaya, which is a very good cinematheque in Montevideo, every year does, best, non-Latin American or non-Uruguayan film, and it won the award in 2019. So in Uruguay, in Montevideo, the people who saw the film there, I'm not sure it was a huge crowd, but they thought enough of it to actually give it the award of best film of the year. So that's lovely. It shows that the film did travel even to spaces outside of, the normal, what we think of as cultural capitals of Europe or the United States or whatever, and that Latin American audiences felt the film and appreciated it very much.
Well, wonderful. Well, I hope that everyone in our audience tonight has certainly taken the time to see it. If not, I would certainly strongly encourage everyone to do so. We've made the links available through the China Institute website. You can rent the film. It is, of course, a multi-hour endeavor. So hopefully you're hunkered down. But it's really quite extraordinary.
I would recommend, if you do see the film, try and watch it in one sitting. I think the power of the film is really cumulative. So I think if you break it up, obviously you can still appreciate it. I think you'll appreciate it a little bit less, because I really try and get that 4-hour time slot available and see the film all at once.
Wonderful advice. Thank you, Richard. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, everyone who participated.
Appreciate it. See you all soon.
Okay, bye-bye.